Right, this is section 4 about Anglican worship. Because you may have assumed that, the vicar just gets into church and does whatever they feel like on a Sunday morning, and then wondered why it always looks like what other vicars do. And that's because actually the vicar isn't free to do whatever they want to on a Sunday morning in an Anglican church. All of us, when we're ordained, take what's called the oath of canonical obedience. It's been that way since at least 1637, but it probably predates the Reformation. And you promise that in public worship and administration of the sacraments, you will use only such forms of service as are allowed by lawful authority and none other. If you're in England, the words are slightly different, but the intention is the same and the ambiguity is the same. In other words, you swear that you, before God and before the bishop, that you will keep to only certain forms of service. So in some ways, analysing Anglican worship is looking at those forms of worship, forms of service, what they are, how they've come to be what they are. But there's an ambiguity in the oath. What does it really mean? And what does it bind you to? And what does it not bind you to? You promise that in public worship and administration of the sacraments, you will use only those forms. So there's an awful lot that's ruled out. Your private prayer life is your private prayer life. You can be as creative as you like in your private prayer life. It's not covered by public worship and administration of the sacraments. Then you've got stuff you do in church that maybe isn't public worship. It's just small group worship where you're a small private group. If you were away on a retreat, it wouldn't be public worship, it would be small private group worship. So that's not covered by the oath. But in what is covered by the oath, what does the "and" mean? Does it mean that there are two categories, public worship and administration of the sacraments? And in those two categories, you must use the forms allowed by lawful authority and none other? Or does it mean only the "and" where they overlap? Only in public worship, that is administration of the sacraments, do you need to be bound by the forms of service? And I wish I could give you absolute clarity on what that means, but the best evidence I've been able to find is that it's ambiguous and it remains ambiguous. But I will say on sacraments that official church policy, as in the 39 articles of religion, says that there are two sacraments, Eucharist and baptism, and the rest are ordinances. Mind you, if you try to use your own words for weddings, you will get into trouble because weddings are a legal ceremony, so they need to be bound by only using the authorised forms of service as well. Then, when you're looking at what the oath means, you have to accept who your lawful authority is. In the Church of England, that's now the General Synod of the Church of England. They pass the measures which authorise forms of services. In the Church in Wales, we have our governing body that authorises forms of service, but our lawful authority might also be our bishops. So if you want to do something a bit crazy, you run it by your lawful authority, who in first instance, if you're a curate or a reader, is your incumbent, your training incumbent or something like that. And in second place is your bishop. And if they say, oh, go with it, you're okay. So that's your lawful authority. And having spoken about the oath, let's move on to something I find more interesting, which is history. But you need to know about the oath because if you're a reader, if you're going to be ordained, you will be taking it. And you may have all the wonderful creative ideas you like for liturgy, but you're going to take an oath before God to be bound by something quite different, and you need to be prepared by that. So, Anglicanism began with Henry VIII and all that. You've seen the mini-series endlessly. You know he got sick of his first wife, wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. The Pope wouldn't give him a divorce, so he came up with a great idea. Let's have a church of my own of which I am the head, and then I can grant myself a divorce and it'll be all easy. And he goes on to have 4 other wives afterwards. This was happening in the years leading up to 1534. The thing was, a lot of the call for breaking with Rome was led by people who were Protestants, who had a different idea about religion, who wanted to protest against what they saw as the power and complacency of the existing church, and wanted to set up something they felt was more honest, more scripturally based, more true to the words of Jesus in the New Testament. But Henry VIII himself probably wasn't that much of a Protestant. He believed that the prince himself, the ruler, should have authority over matters of religion in his country, but that didn't necessarily mean he went along with everything that the Protestants would go along with. However, they were useful to him in doing the break with Rome. So he broke with Rome, and he set up the Anglican Church as a state church for England and Wales, which were then politically united. And he started making moves towards the use of English in worship. The services before had been in Latin. They'd been very visually based, full of a lot of colour and ritual, but you more or less had to have grown up in it to understand what was going on. Now, some of this is very significant for Wales because it was a state church for England and Wales, and although the Tudor family had very strong Welsh links and was strongly supported in Wales, the national language was English, which meant that for a long time they didn't think about translating the scriptures or the service into Welsh. And Welsh people would then suddenly have one language that at least they'd grown up on and was incomprehensible to them, Latin, replaced to another that was even stranger, English. So the idea of the Reformation being about having the Bible in a language you could understand took a long time to bear fruit in Wales. Now, the Reformation had really started about 20 years earlier. This autumn, from the time I'm recording this, we'll be remembering 500 years since Martin Luther, there's a picture of him, a monk from Germany, got so sick of the church around him that, according to legend, he nailed 95 theses, 95 complaints against the church to the cathedral door in Wittenberg. And that anniversary happened on Halloween on the 31st of October. So Halloween 2017 is a really important anniversary. The ideas of Luther could spread really quickly because of new technology, and that was the printing press. The words of this monk in Germany could be spread all the way across to England, to Wales, very quickly and mass-produced in a way they couldn't have been before. So although Luther wasn't the first to say these things, new technology gave the impetus to that spreading really fast. And under the influence of Luther, people began to demand a return to Scripture as the guide of faith, as the measure of faith, and to replace a spirituality based on seeing things to a spirituality on hearing and on understanding and on reading. And in worship, a huge emphasis was put on sincere understanding, on knowing what was going on assenting into it with your mind and your will as well as your heart. There's also a radical questioning of all human authority. If it wasn't in the Bible, why were we doing it? But also this led to a lot of splits and schisms and to wars, as some people fought to keep their way of worshipping and others fought to change it. And even amid those who were wanting to change it, there were some who wanted to change it in one way and some who wanted to change it in another. Was there going to be chaos? Were we going to descend into churches of one person who had everything the way they wanted to, but wasn't actually worshipping with anyone else? How did you keep some sense of community in a world full of radical new ideas? And none of this will be strange to us living in this time, because we're on another technology shift ourselves, the technology shift of the digital revolution, and all those questions have become relevant to us again in a new way. So, trying to sort all that out for England and Wales was a character called Thomas Cranmer, and I won't tell you now about his wife in the basket because I've told that story far too many times, but if you want me to, I will. Thomas Cranmer, he was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1533 to 1555, a long time, 22 years, and over a lot of king and queen's reigns. He saw out Henry VIII, saw his son Edward's through as king and was archbishop just into the time of Mary Tudor as well. He probably wanted a moderate Protestantism, but he was definitely a man who believed that the king did have a right to talk about religion in their country, and as archbishop it was his job to make the king's vision come true. So trying to find out what he actually believed is sometimes a bit harder, because when the king was a hardline Protestant, he was a hardline Protestant. When the king was a soft Protestant, he was a soft Protestant. He was the king's servant. But he couldn't move fast enough for Mary Tudor, who had him arrested for treason and heresy. And although he did recant of everything that he'd done, he was still sent to the stake and burned as a martyr. And legend says he put into the flame first the hand that had signed the recantation. If you believe that or not, you're not. I don't know. But one thing Cranmer was he was a genius for writing English that sounded beautiful. If there are two Elizabethan people, well, two Tudor people, who had a real influence on the English we speak now, it's Shakespeare and then probably Thomas Cranmer. He translated a lot of the services and put together new services for the new Church of England. He worked with teams all the time, but we're not quite sure who was in the team, so Cranmer gets all the credit and all the blame. First thing he did was in 1549, when Edward was king, he put together a complete English prayer book that had services morning and evening prayer, it had a communion service, it had services for the life course in it as well. A whole lot of things like that. 1550, he completed that with an ordinal, an order of service for making bishops, priests and deacons. It was probably Cranmer's intention to become more Protestant by degrees. So first of all, you translated more or less what you had into English with a few small changes, and then a few years later you'd have another prayer book that shifted it a little more far in the Protestant direction, and then a little further in the Protestant direction again. He got as far as 1552, and then King Edward died. Mary Tudor became queen, and the whole process ground into the sand as Mary Tudor tried to change Britain back to being a Catholic country and didn't want anything to do with the prayer books that Cranmer had put together. But Cranmer's prayer books had started to set up the basis for Anglican worship. But Anglican worship was very much a communal thing. The whole community gathered together. But Anglican worship was deeply based in scripture. Every part of the prayer book you can usually trace to a scriptural passage, either directly or indirectly. And that Anglican worship had a set form of words, a very clear structure that could be common, that could be shared by a lot of people. And that common structure had to be decided at quite a high level, at Parliament committee level. It couldn't just be this congregation wants to do it this way. Otherwise there'd be no commonality over the whole of the kingdom. But of course this caused tensions from the beginning, which will come up and up again in the history of Anglican worship, between those who were very much concerned with ritual, ceremony, the way things looked, high Anglicans, and those who were concerned with faithfulness to scripture above all else, and with hearing and with the word and with sincere reaction to that word. And they'd be low Anglicans, and they'd been given, those two poles, high and low, are always with us, but they get given different names over time. So, Mary Tudor becomes queen, Britain becomes Catholic again, Cranmer is executed. Mary Tudor dies probably of cancer in 1558, and her sister Elizabeth becomes queen, and Elizabeth stays queen from 1558 to 1603. Now, what Elizabeth's own religious convictions were much debated. There were elements of Catholicism she loved the music. There were elements of Protestantism she hated. She really hated long sermons. I'm with her there. But there were parts of it that she had to go with because she couldn't be a Catholic. The Pope had ruled her a heretic. She was stuck with Protestantism. And she probably did think it was the way to go if it could go in a moderate form. So what she talked about was not wanting to make windows into people's souls, wanting to have a kind of compromise position for the Anglican Church that could take in both the high and the low, both those who went towards the Catholic end and those who went to the extreme Protestant end. So in 1559, she reissued the 1552 prayer book with minor changes. The interesting thing was that it went through Parliament and all the bishops who were there, some of them were in prison, but all the ones who were there voted against it. It's the only prayer book that was completely voted on by the laity. And she also had that prayer book translated into Welsh fairly soon. The Act of Parliament for it went through in 1563, and the work, mainly by Bishop Richard Davies of St. Davis, Bishop Richard Davis of St. David's, was completed in 1567. The Welsh Bible, the William Morgan Bible, was in 1588. So finally, the Welsh could have the words of scriptures in the language that they really understood. Now, the Elizabethan settlement was about Anglicanism as a middle way, and it pleased very few, as compromises will do, but the important thing was it became settled. Over the long reign of Elizabeth, people got used to it, got used to being a little frustrated with it, but at least it held everything together, and they were very aware of how things could go pear-shaped very quickly if they didn't stick with the settlement. The same prayer book was reissued when James I became king in 1604, again with changes, but none of them that really shifted the liturgy very much. But the Protestants were getting really upset by it. They didn't like responses. The minister says something and the congregation respond. They thought that was too much like games people played at May Day. They didn't like the fact that there was music other than psalms. They didn't like the fact that a lot of the prayers were said by the congregation. Surely it was the people's position to listen in silence and learn and say Amen when they assented, not say all these words. And they didn't think there was really enough scripture in it. They thought there were too long collects and too little Bible reading. So a pressure was building up for a change in the way worship was done. And also at the other end, those who missed all the colour, all the spectacle, all the lavishness of Catholic worship were getting fractious as well. And those tensions build and build over the next 50 years until you get the Civil War, which went from about 1642 to 1651. And as you know, Charles I was executed, and there was the Commonwealth, which lasted until 1660. Now, again, historians argue about how much this was a war of religion, how much it was Catholic against Protestant. And in some places it was, and in some places it wasn't. But what is certain is that when the Commonwealth came to power, they wanted to get rid of Anglican worship as it had been and go for a more Protestant style of worship, a form of worship that was more spontaneous, that was more scriptural, that was free of a lot of the constraints that the idea of a common worship had put on it. So they set about trying to put together their own prayer book, and they failed. And in 1645, they issued the Directory of Public Worship. It wasn't a prayer book. It's a long list of do's and don'ts. If you're interested, you can read it on the internet. It is very interesting. It's mainly don'ts. And it didn't really work as a prayer book because it didn't have a funeral service, because they were so worried about all the superstition of the funeral service and its symbols that it was better not to have any service at all. All these things meant that actually the prayer book was used illegally a lot of the time through the Commonwealth. And there were all kind of tensions, political tensions about worship. If you go to Llandaff Cathedral, you will see bullet holes in the wall, which were caused by Puritan soldiers firing at people for doing something terribly wrong and irreligious. They went to church on Christmas Day. It was enough to want to kill someone for. These are the tensions that came up in the Civil War. And so it's hardly surprising that when King Charles II was restored and the monarchy was restored, one of the things that they wanted to restore was a compromise position on religious worship again. And so in 1662, back came the Book of Common Prayer. And again, it was very much like the 1552 Book of Common Prayer. There were 600 small changes, but the language was still Cranmer's, the way of structuring it was still mainly Cranmer's, with all those faults. But it split Christian worship in Britain between those who could conform to the Book of Common Prayer and those who couldn't, non-conformists, who went off to a much freer style of worship, not constrained by prayer books, not trying to keep this common standard across everywhere. Now, the 1662 Book of Common Prayer was only meant to last 10 years. It was a compromise position until all the trouble of the Civil War had settled down. But the problem was people got used to it again. And actually people didn't want to reopen the can of worms that the Civil War had been. So for a long time, 1662 was kept. And in fact, in the Church of England, it's still the official prayer book, even though it's very rarely used. 18th century worship became deliberately dull in Anglican churches. To be enthusiastic was an insult. And I think part of it was all the hangover that people remembered from the Civil War. They thought if people got too excited about religion, we'd be back in the same state we were. So it was very much a religion of the mind, a religion of preaching. Worship was very much toned down, about order, about civilization, about harmony. And that's gone deep into the fabric of Anglican worship, even though it's not there so much as it once was. The 1662 prayer book was translated into Welsh very quickly, 1664. And these prayer books went with colonists all across the world. And so it influenced, its language and its ways of worshipping influenced a wide strain of Christian believers all the way across the world. And as I say, it's still the official liturgy of the Church of England. What changed between 1662 and 1927, when its power began to break, was not the words that were said, but how they were done. On one end, there was the very Protestant low church way of doing them. This is probably a Methodist service here, but it was how a low church Anglican communion would have looked. The emphasis being on preaching, on the word, on conversion of heart in response to the scripture. And then on the other side, you had those who took a more Anglo-Catholic, high church, whatever, Tractarian, whatever position you want to call it, because it's had various names over time, that looked to the long tradition of Christian worship before the Reformation, that looked to what Roman Catholicism and even Eastern Orthodoxy were doing, and said, actually, no, we want our worship to have colour in it, to have life in it. We don't much care about the words, but we care about the ceremonial. And so in any Victorian church on a given Sunday, you could walk in and find the same words being said, but being said and used in very different ways. In 1920, the church in Wales was disestablished from the Church of England and became a church in its own right, quickly forming into the 6 dioceses we know. And since 1920, we've had the power to authorise our own liturgy, except for marriage, because marriage is also a legal thing, and that gets very complicated. The constitution that was set up in 1920 gave a strong role both to the liturgy, both to the laity in devising liturgy and also to the bishops. Over time, the bishop's aspect has probably predominated. And of course, right from the start, we were a bilingual church. And we've had to rejoice or cope with having 2 languages for worship and what that does. And if you're going to throw in a bit of Greek and Latin, sometimes we have 3 or 4. But going back to England. Meanwhile, back in England, there was real attempt to change the prayer book that had been with them so long. And in 1927, a new version of the prayer book was put to Parliament. It had been authorised by both convocations, like General Synod, but not quite with the same power. So the Church wanted it, but it had to go at that time to the Houses of Parliament, and in Parliament the House of Commons rejected it. Only about 33 votes, because they thought the changes were too popish. A lot of the people voting were not actually Anglicans, and they were voting out of a lot of nostalgia, for this was the way religion had always been done. So, back things came to the General Assemblies, to the Synod, and in 1928 the prayer book was put to Parliament again, and this time it was rejected by 44 votes. The Archbishop changed, and this man, Cosmo Lang, became Archbishop. That's a portrait of him by Laszlo. He was the Archbishop at the time when King Edward went off with Mrs. Simpson, so he gets portrayed a lot in films at the moment, does Cosmo Lang. Cosmo Lang became Archbishop and said, it's not worth trying to put this from Parliament, just use the 1928 prayer book. Don't worry about whether it's authorised or not. And a lot of parishes did, but its authorisation, its legality was very, very ambiguous. Since 1970, that idea that English liturgy had to go back to Parliament has changed, and now the General Synod can vote it in. So this kind of prayer book controversy is not going to happen again in England. But that was the way it went. But the real change came in the 1960s. There'd been a big move to change the church across all the denominations, the liturgical movement, the parish communion movement, talking about the Eucharist as being the Lord's family round the Lord's table on the Lord's Day. And the 1662 Eucharist is very much about judgment. It's not very much about family in the Eucharist. So the language was just felt to be wrong. And plus the fact Vatican II had been opening up the Catholic liturgy as well. And liturgical scholars had started to see that there was a classic tradition in the West of how the Eucharist should be shaped. So all these big changes meant that the Church of England and the Church in Wales really felt their liturgies had to at last get up to date. It wasn't enough about keeping a 500-year-old compromise. It was about serving the community they were in now. So, in 1967 in England, you get Series 1. It changes the shape and authorises all the deviations from 1662 that had been happening anyway. In 1967, you also get Series 2, which tidies up the Crown Marian prayer book, gives it the classic Western shape, which means that when you go into a Roman Catholic church, you'll recognise how the service works because it's working to the same structure. And then in 1973, Series 3 allowed modern worship. Suddenly we weren't talking about God as thou, we were talking about God as you. We weren't keeping Cranmer's phrases all the time. That all became formalised in the Alternative Service Book in 1980, the ASB. Liturgists like abbreviations, so they'll wander about talking to you about BCP for Book of Common Prayer and ASB and whatever, and for a while you'll get very confused and then you'll start using the language yourself. So let's just complete the story for England. From 2000 to 2010, they've been using Common Worship. They've also been using, here's another abbreviation, the Revised Common Lectionary, the RCL, which is a 3-year way of using the Bible instead of Cranmer's, which was a 1-year way of moving through, and missed a lot of the Bible. Later in your course, you will find out a lot more about the RCL and all of it. And there's a growing use of directory or menu worship, that the church sort of sets the structure and then the vicar slots in what words seem suitable or appropriate at the time. There's a growing charismatic element in worship, more about choruses, intense feeling, more about the Spirit waiting for God to do something new. There's a move to getting rid of vestments, and of course there's a technology shift. Every parish can produce its own leaflets. Doesn't have to have a book printed somewhere. And strangely enough, in Common Worship, there's less scripture again, partly because I think it was felt that people couldn't absorb the amount of scripture that was coming in some of the services. We're nearly there, don't worry. Let's just complete the story for Wales. Meanwhile, back in Wales, there were alternative services parallel to the Series 1 and Series 2. And in 1984, a new prayer book was authorised, which gets called the Green Book, but please don't call it the Green Book, call it 1984. The reason I say don't call it the Green Book is it shows you only speak English, because it's only the English-only version that's green. The bilingual one of the Eucharist is red, and the morning and evening prayer bilingual is blue. So calling it the Green Book just shows that you're an English chauvinist, so please don't do it. So this came in 2 volumes. One dealt with the Eucharist and morning evening prayer, and volume 2 has baptisms, weddings, funerals, and all the other stuff in it. It's a very Eucharistic service. Everything practically has to have a Eucharist. And the thou form for talking about God was retained at the last minute. So in terms of what's happening in England, the 1984 prayer book is very, very conservative. And it more or less marked where we were in 1984, but there was a lot of change happening already. So since 1984, there were aims to have alternative modern language forms of the services. Some were issued in 1992 and 1994, and these contain complete directory outlines. As an alternative, just have this, this and this in the service and slot in whatever you want. Far greater use, growing use of the Revised Common Lectionary. And since 1994, in 2004, we had the Order for the Eucharist, and 2009, Daily Prayer. These have even more choice, to the point where it's really hard to use these as prayer books. And you have to use them as minds to produce service sheets, because the congregation can't find their way through. So you need to decide what's authorised, what's the service that you've agreed to use, and what's suitable, what suits that particular occasion. And part of what we'll be doing in this module is exploring ideas of what's authorised and what's suitable. And also there have been various modern pastoral offices, such as a revision of the marriage service and a revision of the funeral service. So just to conclude, Anglican worship gives a central place to the scripture. It has a strong link with the past. It's experienced tension from the very beginning, so it's often a compromised position, because it wants to say that the community gathered together, even though there are tensions, is important. So it's got a commitment to common prayer and common worship, but it's changing fast. And those changes mean that it needs far more than ever people who understand worship. So in other words, it needs you. I wish you every blessing with this module. If you need any help, get in touch. Thank you for your attention and enjoy it, because I find worship utterly fascinating, and I hope you do too.